no, I think we can get started. Let the record show that the quorum is present and the meeting is recalled to order at 1:50. We have present the Honorable Franz Manderson, the Deputy Governor and Head of the Civil Service, and his Chief Officer, Ms. Gloria Nixon McField. And we're going to start the investigation this afternoon into the management of the Nation Building Fund, which was done in July 2015. Mr. Manderson, I agree with your, with the first recommendation should develop and implement a robust framework, and the management response is that exists. I guess my question is, how did we get, I'm sorry, my apologies.
That's good point, Ross. You're getting ahead of yourself, sir.
I'm sorry. In keeping with normal practice, we'll invite the Auditor General to make an opening statement. My apologies, sir.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, members of Public Accounts Committee, officials from the Ministry of Finance, and ladies and gentlemen in the gallery, good afternoon. Again, just to indicate, I have with me today Mr. Martin Rubin, the Audit Director responsible for performance audits, who led the audit work supporting the Nation Building Program audit report you'll be reviewing in today's hearing. Again, thank you for the opportunity to make some opening remarks. The Nation Building Program operated from 2009 to June 2013 and dispersed a total of $13.2 million. During this time period, $5 million was provided to various churches, $3.8 million was spent on scholarships, and another $4.4 million to others. This program created a significant level of public interest about how the funds were used. As a result, my office undertook a performance audit to determine the extent to which these payments provided value to the people of the Cayman Islands. While on a conceptual level, the goals and objectives of the Nation Building Program may be worthy and desirable, the implementation of this program, though, was fundamentally flawed, and there was little evidence to determine whether the government achieved any lasting value from the investment of $13.2 million. And while I could discuss a myriad of concerns leading to the conclusion that government mismanaged $13.2 million in public funds approved by the Legislative Assembly over a 4-year time period, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight how we believe government could use this report to improve how it manages public resources in the future. The key finding was that the Nation Building Program was operated outside the government's own governance framework. What this means is that we found that the laws and policies in place for government to spend public monies were circumvented in almost every possible way. The Public Management and Finance Law first came into effect on July 1st, 2014. Since that time, the expenditure of public funds approved by the Legislative Assembly has been the responsibility of the chief officers and their officials. According to the law, it is the chief officers who are to ensure proper controls are in place to ensure public funds are spent with due regard to value for money, and that they are made in accordance with the direction provided by the legislatures, either in legislation or through budgetary measures. We found that this program was managed by the former Premier of the Cayman Islands and his officials in the Premier's office. The chief officer was absent and did not play the role required of him set out in the PMFL. For example, the chief officer should ensure that the control frameworks in place prevent the abuse of public funds and ensure value for money. There was no clear objectives, policies, criteria, or even proper application forms used to operate the program. The chief financial officer, who reported to the chief officer in the finance ministry, was provided information about how much, who, and where to send the checks. We strongly believe that the findings in this report were to a large part the result of an organizational culture that made it very difficult to challenge ministers about their actions, even actions clearly outside their roles. Public statements from the former Premier around the time of the issuance of our report confirm our assessment of the organizational culture during the time of the operations of the program that resulted in a disregard for the laws governing the management of public monies. In recommendation 2 of our report, we indicate that government should ensure that appropriate roles and responsibilities are clearly articulated for all government programs, in line with the framework outlined in the Constitution and laws, and that they are administered by officials to ensure compliance with the law and to avoid the risk of abuse and waste of public funds. This is not a simple recommendation given the environment we found when conducting this audit. For example, the offices of government ministers are situated right next to civil servants. The PMFL requires civil servants to ensure the lawful expenditure of public funds while ensuring to the best degree possible public funds are used with due regard for value for money. This adds to the challenges for chief officers and their officials who must follow the law, whereby under no circumstances should ministers of government direct government officials about specific roles and responsibilities. It is the government's responsibility to have assurance that the funds were spent appropriately and that value for money was achieved, whether they are entity or executive funds as detailed in the current law. This is why it is the public officials who are responsible and who are answerable to Public Accounts Committee to respond to questions about how well they have carried out their responsibilities, not ministers. Many reports issued by my office discussed situations where ministers overreached their authority provided for in the Constitution and the PMFL. These include, for example, ministers involved in the negotiation of significant arrangements with developers, the direction of individual social service payments, the determination of where a patient goes for overseas medical treatment, the design and construction of schools, and the determination of education methods. All these situations are precluded by the PMFL and the Public Service Management Law and what good governance demands. Unless government officials take steps to enforce the provisions set out in the PMFL and provide significant consequences in those situations where the roles are transgressed, it is highly likely that there will be future situations like the nation building program where accountability for the use of public funds is lost, an opportunity for abuse and waste of public funds is allowed to happen. While the Deputy Governor has committed by November 2015 in its response to the report to put in place training for government officials to prevent this kind of situation arising again, we believe that there needs to be more done to ensure to the greatest possible extent respect for the law and good governance in the future. Changing the culture of an organization does not happen without significant intervention by leaders who are dedicated to making those changes happen. In conclusion, government failed to effectively manage over $13.2 million of public money funded under the nation building program, leading to a waste of public funds. Senior government officials failed to discharge their duties to safeguard public funds, failed to protect the public interest, and failed their duties under the law. There are important lessons to be learned from this audit for the management of government programs going forward, whether they be transfer payments or other type of grant funding to organizations. We have made 3 significant recommendations to government that, if properly implemented, should help ensure the risk of a situation like this happening again is significantly reduced. In closing, I would like to reiterate that ministers and chief officers must play the roles demanded by the Constitution and the laws of the Cayman Islands in order for there to be any chance for government programs and services to provide the kind of results deserving of the people of the Cayman Islands. Anything less, in my opinion, is unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Continue now then, Mr. Manderson. The report, as the Auditor General has said, is not a good report. The report places much of the blame and for what happened on the premier, the former premier. We'll talk about the report and his involvement in it. My question to you is, having given the statement made by the Auditor General and your response that basically the ministers set policy and the civil service administrators are bound by the provisions of the public management and finance law for the implementation side of it. How is it possible that it was allowed to deteriorate over such an extended period of time to where we're at and what the report reports?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a statement I would like to read, but certainly I'll answer your question first. The short answer is that civil servants didn't do their jobs as effectively as they should have. Those persons are no longer in the service now, but we have an overriding responsibility to learn from these mistakes or these failings, and to ensure that we have all of the necessary frameworks in place to ensure that it doesn't happen. You're correct, sir, in that in our response, we do say that there is framework here now, and that is true. It is in our laws and regulations. But what I have found is that it is not. There's not a consistent policy across the civil service, and that is something that we are now addressing. And I sent out some documents just yesterday to demonstrate the work that we have done to address these concerns. But sir, to answer your question, it was simply put that civil servants allow themselves to be pressured or to go about doing things that they shouldn't have done, and they fail to carry out their responsibilities as set out in the laws and regulations.
You can proceed with your statement now, as long as it's not in more than 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I'm just being fictitious.
4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay.
Yes, sir.
That sounds like a government response.
Yes, sir. But first, sir, I would like to thank the Public Accounts Committee and the Audit Office for the report on nation building. Such reports identify opportunities for improving the delivery of government services and lead to government reviewing its practices and making improvements. Constructive feedback is an integral part of our governance framework. As Deputy Governor, I have developed a close working relationship with the Audit Office, not only in response to audit reports, but by proactively seeking out their expertise to inform working groups, committees, and training initiatives. The recent working group on procurement is an example of a successful collaboration. This report, as the Auditor General has said, covers a period from 2009 to 2013 and highlights deficiencies in the handling of transfer payments under the Nation Building Fund. It is important to add, Mr. Chairman, that this is not the practice of partnering with civil, that it is not the practice of partnering with civil society that has been called into question, but rather the government's management of such programs, particularly when they are funded through transfer payments. The challenge moving forward, therefore, is to ensure that there are clear and measurable policy objectives underpinning these public-private initiatives and clear internal controls on how such funds are spent. There are numerous lessons for the gatekeepers of public expenditures. The system relies on parliamentarians, ministers of cabinet, and civil servants understanding and fulfilling their roles to provide the necessary checks and balances. Speaking for the civil service, it is our job to advise on the use of public funds and to put in place proper mechanisms around the formulation and delivery of programs to achieve value for money. At the time the report was produced, I assured the Auditor General that I would take his recommendations seriously and implement changes. And therefore, please, Mr. Chairman, to outline a number of initiatives that have been undertaken. Mr. Chairman, I would like to structure my address around 3 recommendations which are set out in Appendix 1. Recommendation 1 deals with the development of a robust framework for the development and management of government programs. And Mr. Chairman, you heard me say this morning that we have adopted the Project Future methodology, which is being rolled out across the civil service, but it is a methodology that benefits the civil service more broadly by providing the tools to improve program delivery overall, based upon the business case methodology used by the UK Civil Service. It provides a robust framework for the development of government programs from the strategic assessment phase to the outline business case to project implementation, and finally, and just as important, the post-implementation review and assessment. So, Mr. Chairman, Project Future is designed to strengthen governance practices and improve the success rate of projects by requiring the use of robust planning and project delivery methodology. This means that Project Future programs require an outline business case. This expands the requirements set out in the framework for fiscal responsibility, which creates the requirement in respect to major capital projects. And also, Mr. Chairman, as I said, the use of outline business cases and strategic assessment. None of these were used, obviously, in the nation building fund. And also, Mr. Chairman, we look at closeout reports for all projects that include the extent to which the project was delivered on time, on budget, and to the required quality standards, as well as lessons learned. So we want to make sure that when we deliver a project, we can look back to see how we can do it better. That is something that we were not doing in the past. Civil servants, Mr. Chairman, have been trained to be able to understand the changes that are required to develop these new skills. To date, 75 civil servants across the Cayman Islands Civil Service has been trained in project management and the use of project management software. This training took place November 14 through February 2015. Mr. Chairman, additionally, 80 civil servants have been trained in the methodology for developing business cases. Again, something that was not done in the past. Members of cabinet has participated in the training, chief officers, and business case writers across the civil service. So it has been a really collaborative approach with good participation from all sectors of government. Mr. Chairman, I've already said that we have established a major projects office in the Ministry of Planning, and that is intended to improve the design and delivery of major capital projects. Mr. Chairman, recommendation 2, and I'm conscious I'm on my 4-minute mark. Recommendation 2 deals with clearly articulating appropriate roles and responsibilities. Mr. Chairman, the government is currently sponsoring 2 important pieces of legislation that are in the drafting stage, and I spoke about them earlier this morning. The Public Authorities Bill and the Procurement Bill, and both of these, Mr. Chairman, I want to emphasize, focus on the roles and responsibilities for public servants. The Public Authorities Bill proposes a completely new governance structure. The purpose of the legislation is to improve the governance and performance of the statutory authorities and government companies. All SAGCs have been consulted, and we are now finalizing the consultation process to include the entire civil service and government. The procurement bill and regulations drafting has been finalized, and we will be getting that down to, as I said earlier, to caucus shortly. But Mr. Chairman, I want to just focus on recommendation number 3, which talks about recommendation deals with transfer payments and having a procedure in place. Mr. Chairman, the deficiencies that have been identified in the government handling of transfer payments has been addressed by our Financial Secretary, Mr. Jefferson, and his ministry, who has developed for the first time a draft governance framework for transfer payments. In recognition of the fact that this is a highly subjected area of expenditure, this framework addresses the legislative authority, policy objectives, roles of key agents, including ministers, of cabinet, cabinet itself, and chief officers, program design and management, transparent and open application process, disclosure and reporting obligation, and post-implementation evaluation for programs funded by transfer payments. This is a significant step in the right direction, Mr. Chairman. The Audit Office also points out that the objective of certain transfer payments are not always identifiable, which makes measurement of results difficult, if not impossible. And I'm requesting that the FS and his team also tackle this issue. There are existing framework for addressing this, and again, with greater focus on quality controls, we can insist upon the necessary details of the strategic objectives and program perimeters be set out in budget documents, including demonstrating a clear link to agreed broad outcomes as established in the annual strategic policy statement. Mr. Chairman, I hope that the statement that I've given and I've sent around the documents yesterday will show that we have been investing a lot of time and resources into tackling this problem. We do not want to see these failings happen again. I have certainly committed to doing everything I can to ensure that we learn from these lessons and that we take the necessary steps to ensure that this does not happen again. Mr. Chairman, I also just by closing by saying that we are ahead of the game in terms of the policy on transfer payments. We promised it in July, but we are now have our first draft now, and it's my intention to have it finished certainly within the next few weeks. But Mr. Chairman, I think everyone here will agree that we're dealing with culture, and the acting Auditor General said that it is something that we have to change. We have to be fearless when we're attacking these issues. It's not going to happen. All of the changes that we want are not going to happen overnight, but with the necessary drive, commitment, and a joined-up approach, I am absolutely confident that we will address the concerns that are set out here, and that we will be doing things much better going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for the statement. Very informative, and I'm glad to hear that you're doing all that stuff. I guess the question I would have is, I would assume that the stage at which the procurement bill and the public authorities bill are at, and the drafting instructions are approved, that you have full cabinet support to bring those legislation forward to the Legislative Assembly.
Sir, I get reminded about it quite often by ministers. They're anxious for it to come forward, so it's my job to deliver it, and I will deliver that to the cabinet in April.
Okay, well, that is particularly enlightening, because I don't think that's always been the position with the public authorities bill, which we've been trying to get for well over a decade.
Yes, sir.
But they say, mango don't drop till it ripe.
Yes, sir.
I guess the question I have for Ms. McFeel is, I know that you all have been doing a lot of work from other presentations I've been to on the appraisal process of the performance of individual civil servants. So is the performance appraisal of individual civil servants to the point where now, if this was to happen again, the lack of performance of the civil servants who allowed this or acquiesced to this happening and participated in the process could be identified very early on in the process and not wait until 2-3 years down the road?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In answer to your question, the performance appraisal systems, one of the factors that's included in every chief officer's performance appraisal is the extent to which they are able and have demonstrated compliance with regulatory authorities. During that process, the Deputy Governor would seek the input of key authorities, including the Auditor General's office, to find out if there are any concerns about the responsiveness of the chief officers as it relates to concerns for their areas of responsibility. So that is an annual process that's already in place. But as the Deputy Governor has said, a big part of this is also culture change, and we are committed to that. It's so much so that the 5-year strategic plan, which the Deputy Governor has commissioned and which is in the process of being implemented now, has as one of its themes good governance. It's not something that we can change. Preventing this type of issue is not something that we can change simply with the issuance of a policy. It will take, as you have said yourself, Mr. Chairman, sustained effort and consciousness on our part. So holding direct reports accountable is something that the Deputy Governor has already commenced, but we also need to make sure that that is pervasive so that everyone has a proper understanding of their roles and responsibilities.
Well, when I was in the civil service a long time ago, we won't get into how many years ago that was, that where we're trying to get back to now was the accepted culture at that time. And one wonders how we got from there. When I was a member for an EXCO, it was an expectation on my part as minister and an expectation on behalf of the public that I represented, that if I stepped out of line as minister and tried to implement a policy that might have been agreed on publicly and could have been a good policy, but if I stepped out of line either by trying to intervene or by asking for things to be done which were not proper and in total compliance and in accordance with established legislation, the expectation was that the permanent secretary, that's what they were called in, right, had the authority to refuse to perform that duty that I was asking them to do. And it was a common, not that that I was such a bad minister, or member, but we had many discussions, and again, getting back to the point the Deputy Governor made earlier, is that as politicians, we have a limited time frame that we want things done in. And oftentimes we push the envelope. But I'm glad to know, and I hope it doesn't take as long to get back to that culture where the expectation and the norm is that the chief officer is responsible for implementation, but also accepts a certain amount of responsibility for policy development, because a lot of this needs to be put in on the front end when we're developing the policy. And I just want to get the assurance that that's the culture we're trying to get back to when we talk about a culture change.
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. And I don't want to give the impression that that is not happening now. Yes, I know that chief officers do have those conversations with ministers all the time. The good news, the issue is we never hear about when it is done right. If we're only down here when things go wrong. So it is happening now. Our chief officers are giving advice to ministers all the time about what can be done and can't be done. So it's happening. Here's a clear example of when it didn't happen, but it is important, as Ms. McFeel-Nixon said, is that we have to continually hold the line and push these things across the civil service so that we get better all the time.
Any questions from the committee members? Mr. Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you. For government officials who do not fulfill roles and responsibilities, can you give us some examples of the most, I guess, the highest level of sanctions, and also whether or not, given the instances in this report where there were conflicts in people processing payments and other staff members who were also beneficiaries, what kind of sanctions or write-ups or some sort of punitive efforts have been made on part of the government to correct behavior, or at least let people be conscious of behavior going forward?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Through you, sir. Mr. Chairman, when civil servants do not follow the rules, depending on the nature of the breach, it can lead to a warning all the way to separation from the service. It depends on the factors, and we have to do a proper investigation, and we have to ensure that there is fairness on both sides in terms of taking into account all of the circumstances at the time. We want to be fair to civil servants. We don't know what pressures they were under, what was happening at the time they made these decisions. So it's very difficult to sort of pinpoint and say what would happen on each occasion. But again, I want to get back to the situation where, and I think this is where you're getting to, sir, is that, you know, having the rules is one thing, enforcing them and holding firm is another. And that is why I've been trying my endeavor best to make sure that chief officers, CFOs, other senior civil servants know that if they get uncomfortable, that's where I come in. The governor is here, we have our premier, we can always push things up the ladder to prevent these problems. Obviously, that was not happening during this time, and we don't want to go back there.
Thanks for that, DJ. I guess, and this is, I guess, for the listening and viewing public, because we have a responsibility to manage their money in the best possible way that we can, and to be accountable to them for you know, things that go awry. And you know, in the AG's report, they talked about you know, the situation being a blank check for the former premier to basically do as he and his chief of staff wanted, or it seemed that way because of those are the only two people controlling it. There were no budgets in place. There were until you know, well into the program, there weren't any criteria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the report, yes, it's a nightmare in terms of, you know, what could go wrong and it going wrong, because there's still money that I guess is outstanding, $30,000 for a gym equipment that never materialized. So it was literally giving money away. And so, you know, when you read those things, the public needs to know, and definitively, I think that somebody is guarding the house, and that there are, you know, all the necessary checks and balances. And even if you're in a regime where, and I'm trying to be as careful as I can be as well, where it's on a, it's in a regime where things aren't going in accordance with good governance practices, etc. That somehow there's somebody that can push the stop and emergency button. Who is that in the system, and what do you tell your staff now going forward of if these situations occurred again? What is the stop valve or stop button on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you. It's very clear that the chief officer in the ministry is the one who is responsible for the implementation and delivery of the programs. So they have the finger on the button to say, this is not right. I don't think this is value for money. I don't think we have the necessary controls in place, or this breaches the controls that we have. I'm not comfortable with this. I'm not going to give authority for the check to be signed. The CFOs have also responsibilities as well. So that's where the responsibilities lie. If they then feel, or they are pressured, and they feel still, you know, that they're being pressured to do something that they feel uncomfortable about, that's where I come in. Obviously, I had to know about it for me to take action, so they have to bring it to my attention. And I do, you know, we have our regular meetings to discuss issues, so I would believe I would become aware of any types of issues. And then there are clear provisions set out in the laws about what happens next. So if a chief officer comes and says, listen, I think I'm being pressured to do something that is not value for money or is breaching the controls, then I can take the matter to the premier and say, sir, here's what's being alleged. Can you speak to your minister? If these things continue to happen, I can elevate it to the governor, who can then raise it with the premier as well. So there are set things in place to make sure that we do things correctly. The issue is having the strength and the necessary abilities to hold fast, to say, I am not doing this. But chief officers need to know, and I've told them this, you have my support. I am here to back you up. Once you do things correctly, I am there for you. Now, if you go out and do things that are totally wrong, and you know it's wrong, then I'm going to have to take action as well, because I have to do my job. So I think I've made that exceptionally clear to all those persons who report to me, and I've told them to push that down throughout the entire civil service. You do things correctly, and you will be supported. You go follow the laws, you will be held to account.
Mr. McDougall.
Through you, sir, my questions to the Auditor General. In your opening statement, I think you acknowledged the work done, or things that the Deputy Governor had done already with regard to, I think it was point number 1 or number 2, what there were only 2. That the roles and responsibilities are clearly articulated and stuff, but I think you also said that you believe that more could be done. I recall you making that statement. I think I got it in the right context. If I hadn't, then I would appreciate the clarification. But I was keen to learn from you, what more did you think could be done? Or what other things did you think could be done?
Okay, thank you. I'll just maybe reread a bit of that statement there, so I'll put it into context. In regards, I said, well, the Deputy Governor has committed by November 2015 in his response to the report to put in place training for government officials to prevent this kind of situation arising again. We believe that there needs to be more done to ensure to the greatest possible extent respect for the law and good governance in future. And changing the culture of an organization does not happen without significant intervention by leaders who are dedicated to making those changes happen. And I think in regards to that, more to be done would be, it's that changing culture and attitudes and really defining what those roles and responsibilities are of the ministers, of MLAs, and when those boundaries are crossed, as he's indicated already, who is the person, the go-to person to help intervene in those situations, because a lot of people from our conversations as well quite often feel threatened about especially their work. Will I continue to have a job if I stand up to someone? And so it's that cultural behavior. I think that's part of it, is how do we change more of it. And I did address another portion in my opening statement that wasn't really in the audit report, but was talking about just even the ministers being situated right alongside civil servants in the government administration buildings. So that, when we look across other jurisdictions, usually doesn't happen. The ministers in that are situated a distance away, and they'll have contact with maybe the chief officer, but not with the rest of the civil servants. And when you're put in that environment, the access to other civil servants to put pressure on them, it can become much greater. So it's just a symptomatic sign.
But I think realistically, if a minister wanted to put pressure on any member of the civil service, regardless of where they were sitting, he still could do it. I'm just curious as to how effective that really could be.
I think it just provides easier opportunity. I know in a small community like this, a lot of people know more people here. So maybe that's the downside of it, that they will, outside of maybe even the government administration building, go and talk to an individual somewhere else and influence that way. So there's other aspects to it where that situation can happen, and especially in a smaller community. Mr. Rubin has further comments you want to make?
The Auditor General and I put together the opening remarks before we got the governance framework here that the Deputy Governor has shared with the committee, which I went through very briefly, and I want to congratulate him. I think it's a very, very good start, and it's got it ticks pretty much all the boxes that I could think of right off the bat. So I'd like to say, it's very good. However, and so the auditor always says, however. That's our. What's it? Stop right there. However, the implementation of this policy is going to be a significant challenge for Mr. Manderson and his officials. I have to say. It's always important to have the framework in place and all the rules in place, but then it's a matter of getting the staff that will need to implement it as they go through, putting in place the specific procedures that need to be put in place in order for these policies to be respected. I think this is a tremendous start. There's actually some...
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm getting a little concerned about this use of the word culture, because from what I know of the civil service, I believe this particular event is certainly extremely abnormal in the civil service, and I don't think that it is the culture of the civil service that I know that this is how they would normally do things. I think it is, and I don't want the listening public to believe that this is anything more than a serious carbuncle on the whole civil service modus operandi.
Absolutely, I agree. So
I just want to,
right.
that we understand that what we're talking about here is one instance, one program that went extremely bad, right? But I believe in fairness to the, and that is why I started when I did, because I believe that most of the civil service are conformists when it comes to procedures and stuff like that. And I don't believe that it is going to be as difficult as this particular series of events or this particular program makes it seem that it would be. And I certainly hope it wouldn't.
This particular policy does have application across the public service. And it's acknowledged in this document by the Deputy Governor that this is not just for... It's applicable across the public service, and it's needed across the public service. I guess what I'm saying is that there are still situations across the public service where programs are being delivered without the kind of structure that is needed. So that's what I'm referring to, and that in terms of the implementation of this policy, I believe, and again, I congratulate the Deputy Governor for starting out on this process, but that's in the comments that we made in that report. We didn't have this, and what we said reflected on the fact that in addition, a policy and then all the rollout of throughout the government of this policy and the training, the practices and the procedures and the accountability frameworks, all of that, and how that all will work, because that'll change a number of people's jobs in the process will, in fact, and then the performance reporting framework, all of that will be around making sure that this policy is fully implemented. That's what I was referring to.
Oh, yeah. Because I guess I could ask you a more direct question. In the instances that you believe that the civil service are not following the rules that may exist, or in some cases maybe that the rules do not exist at that level in that particular area, do you envisage anything as bad as this existing out there. And well, I'm asking the Auditor General, in your auditing of the system, do you believe that there is anything comparable to what went on in the Nation Building Fund going on currently?
Based upon the work that I've performed over the last 7 years, and the answer would be no.
Before I ask this question, I'll declare that until recently, I was in the Ministry of Education, Employment, and Gender Affairs. So I am involved in a case that's going to be brought before courts relatively soon. But I'm asking the question in a general sense, but it regards the scholarships. So I just wanted to declare that, Mr. Chairman. As a witness, based on my role in the government, not my role taking anything from the Nation Building Fund, I might add. But we've seen in the report, a number of monies going out for students. We've heard that there were no checks and balances for the first 2 years of the program, and then there were criteria then put in place. Can you tell me, if you recall, kind of what spurred that action? Because obviously somebody saw something or said something, and then systems were being put in place. Was that the intervention then by the civil servants to try to corral this, or was that something that emanated out of the then Premier's office without any kind of instigation by the civil service?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I am not aware of this being driven by civil servants at all. In terms of the scholarships, it was my understanding and was that there were a number of children who were not meeting the criteria to get an education scholarship. They obviously wanted to further their education, and representations were made to someone as to whether they could have access to this fund, and it was agreed that yes, that would happen. Obviously, the report demonstrates that the very strict criteria, the application process, the vetting that was done by education was not happening on the nation building side. And that led to a number of issues as identified in the audit. I think that's the best I can answer that question, sir.
I guess what I was asking for, do you know what triggered then the imposition of criteria 2 years into the fact, into the program, versus it being there from the beginning?
Mr. Chairman, no, I don't have that answer, sir. I don't know.
I believe, being a member of the Legislative Assembly at that time, I believe that some of it may have come out due to questions in the Finance Committee in comparing the two, because there were members of the Legislative Assembly who was getting representation from parents who were not getting the education scholarship, and from those who, or even from those who got the education scholarship or less, but they were perturbed that their children were being held to this academic performance standard, and in many instances their children had gotten less monetary from government, but they were being held to the strict education in order for the continuing of the scholarship, whereas they knew of people who were getting nation building scholarships but were not being held to that same performance criteria. And I think some of that may have led the people in the ministry then to say, well, we better start putting some paperwork in place here, because these questions are likely to increase, not go away. just trying to remember some of the sequences that were going on in here.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. No, I was wondering if that was the start of the civil service, basically flexing its muscles and saying, okay, enough's enough, so let's put some. So I was just wondering if you had any history there. But clearly, this is an example of how not to do it, right? So I think in years from now, hopefully somebody in some governance class somewhere can use it and get some advantage out of it, out of this sad situation as to what not to do. But that being said, in terms of the next steps, and we've heard what you're doing, is it a scenario or would you commit to this committee that on an annual basis these things would kind of be raised, or especially with new people coming into the system, and using possibly something like this as an example and saying, look, here's the classic case of you're a young civil servant, you have a minister, in some cases the highest minister of the land, the premier, saying, this is what we do. You had some people not saying anything, not doing anything. Do you keep going back to this as a sounding board and saying, okay, guys, here's a learning tool, right? And if you do this and you don't say, going back to what you said, has that kind of been something that you do with each new class of civil servants as they come in? Like you kind of teach them by example, show them the way, and use it as a sounding board? Because I think, out of every disaster there comes opportunities, and obviously, from what you're saying, from what the Auditor General is saying is, from your commitment right up front, you've committed to do whatever it takes. But we shouldn't forget the past, is what I'm trying to say, and we should use these as examples going forward to remind people, if only that if you do this stuff, there are dire consequences. But if you do the right thing from the start, you come to us and we'll support you, and we'll go to bat all the way up to the governor, basically, for you. Are those lessons that you do in orientation and other things like that? From your processing.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yes, sir, that's an excellent point. A lot of this is not necessarily people willfully wanting to do things wrong. They just want to get the programs done. So we started when the new government came in with an orientation program, because we were aware that a lot of persons had not been in government before. We will now, having now had the benefit of this report, put a lot of more emphasis on our new orientation program for new people coming into government, the emphasis on role clarity and ensuring that ministers from day one understand what their roles are. Having this policy on transfer payments is going to be critical, that it makes everyone understand exactly what their roles are. So yes, and I say it all the time, and I actually hear ministers saying it, I don't want another nation building report. And because we have shined a light on these things, and that's the way to stop these things from happening, is to shine a light on these things, the work that the Auditor General does, the work of this committee, the public understanding what's happening. Those are things that stop people from doing things that they shouldn't do, is us having a very open and transparent process. So yes, I think this is a great opportunity for us to learn. Some hard lessons have been learned, and we should capitalize on that to make sure that we have the systems in place to not let it happen again.
Do you have any other questions for the DG and the Chief Officer?
Mr. Chairman, just to conclude, and I thank you for making that point about the culture that we were talking about, because I thank you for raising it, is because, like I said, we get it right almost every day, right? We enforce the rules, we do things correctly, This is a time when we didn't, and I want to agree with you that this is not the norm. You know, we do things by the book. I mean, I'm so proud of the work that we're doing now, for example, with Project Future, the governance structures that we have put in place, the work we're doing on major capital projects. We're doing things the right way, and I wouldn't want the public to think that there is some culture in the civil service of doing things the wrong way, because that's not the case. Do we need to improve our culture of accountability and high performance? Yes, we need to always focus on those things. But in terms of obeying the rules and getting things right, I think we do that very well, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. My next witness will be Mr. Jefferson. You can remain in your seat, sir. We don't need to bring you down.
Thank you, sir.
Well, I guess the first question I would have for you, sir, is this transfer payment policy and procedure that the Deputy Governor referred to, and what are your expectations from that to improve and prevent this kind of system in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, with your kind permission, if I could also start with a short opening statement that would certainly be no more than 3 minutes, and then I'll refer to you.
Well, yeah, I'm not a big fan of opening statements, because I think it gives you the opportunity to set the tone and the direction that we're going, and I think that's my role, but I'll let you do it since you prepared it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I assure you, on the committee, it's quite neutral, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, once again, thank you for allowing me to make this short statement. The nation building program that the committee is now looking at with the report before it was an example of a transfer payment. And although transfer payments, Mr. Chairman and committee members, is relatively modest in relation to the entire government's annual budget, modest though they be, transfer payments do have a significant impact on a large number of individuals in particular. And they also impact some entities operating in the Cayman Islands. So if we were to examine the current 15-16 budget, transfer payments in total are budgeted at $32.6 million for the year, representing approximately 6% of the fiscal year's total operating expenditures of $552.8 million. Of that $32.6 million total of transfer payments budgeted for this fiscal year, 5 transfer payments dominate the total. And those 5, Mr. Chairman and committee members, are local and overseas scholarships and bursaries, $10.7 million. Poor relief payments, $6.3 million. Ex gratia benefit payments to seamen, $6 million. Poor relief vouchers, $1.3 million. And benefit payments to ex-servicemen, veterans, $1.1 million, for a total for those 5 of $25.4 million, representing 78% of the overall $32.6 million for transfer payments. Mr. Chairman, a transfer payment can be defined as a payment made by government without any expectation on the part of government that a service or a good will be obtained from the recipient of that payment made by government. Mr. Chairman, as the committee has heard, the report before us contains 3 recommendations, the third of which is that a governance framework be established. And the Ministry of Finance, along with the Deputy Governor's Office, obviously agreed with the recommendation, because there are many benefits to be obtained from establishing a governance framework. And the Ministry of Finance has drafted such a governance framework and shared it obviously with the Deputy Governor, who in turn passed it on to the committee members and yourself, and copies to the audit office. Mr. Chairman, the framework, when it's finalized, and the plan is that it'll be finalized fairly soon, it will be issued to all government agencies so that their existing set of rules, Mr. Chairman, pertaining to transfer payments can be strengthened. So they will look at their existing methods and rules for how they go about governing transfer payments in relation to the structure that was just delivered to the committee yesterday, and see how the two lines up. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your agreement for me to make this statement, and I think I've probably answered your question earlier about the expectations in the future to say that we would expect, we will issue the structure to all chief officers so that, as I say, they in turn can gauge their existing rules and the way they govern their operations by reference to the structure that has been set out here. If I did have a fair, it would be that we have to be careful in that we don't go overboard with what we do and end up with an overly bureaucratic situation governing transfer payments. That would be my one concern, that we use what has been recommended as a framework, we use it sensibly.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. I guess the other question I would have is, during the budgetary process, or does your criteria that you're establishing for transfer payments require that transfer payments be properly developed and budgeted for? Because I think that in this case, this one was put in the budget here in Finance Committee, and whether, if the requirement is that the transfer payment must be properly developed, it must be properly structured, there must be proper rationale for it as part of the criteria for the whole establishment of a particular transfer payment, then I believe that the committee would have a certain amount of comfort in knowing that it is unlikely that it will be inserted as a transfer payment without that preparation taking place.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly, the framework that has been drafted, first of all, envisages that the reasons for the transfer payment in the first place being made public. It envisaged that the criteria in order for a person to receive a transfer payment be made public. And nowadays that would obviously be done on websites, would be the most likely place to put that. And the rules themselves as to how an award will be made known. And certainly ministers in the process of Finance Committee, excuse me, will have that information on hand that they can share with MLAs and to make that known. Mr. Chairman, I have in front of me a page from the annual plan and estimates document back for the fiscal year 12-13, and on the page it's detailing out the various transfer payments, and for the promotion of nation building transfer payment 52 as it was then, the level of information, and I think that was the penultimate year, is quite terse and scarce. And it says, support for schools, sporting culture, and other voluntary organization, and then a series of bullet points. Grant support for church-based after-school programs, grant to NCVO Pines Retirement Home, scholarship grants to young persons, grants to churches for construction of emergency shelters. So the information in the actual budget document at that time was pretty limited. And certainly ministers would be armed in the future with a properly developed program which their chief officers would have on hand and would be able to defend the program in Finance Committee if it was required to be defended. But certainly the there should be a greater volume of information in the future going forward, coming out of the framework that has been is being put forward as a good guide for how the programs should work.
And that was the second year. But yeah, you used the word penultimate, but I think it was a 3-year program. 3 years or 4?
Yeah, actually, Mr. Chairman, the 12-13 year was actually the last year. So
Okay.
I said penultimate, but it's
But
actually...
because I think if you went back to look at the original
Yeah.
year, there was nothing.
the detail would have been
But Ben's
less.
was, yeah, well, I think it was zero. If I recall, it was created in the middle of Finance Committee. Any questions from the committee?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, in terms of your oversight, FS, what have you done since this report to contribute to, the good governance and best practices going forward, so that, again, from the civil service arm, there are checks and balances, so that this doesn't happen again, especially when it comes to doing the budgets and being integral in budgets and having that level of scrutiny, reporting, those sorts of things.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I think that a few things that we've done. One is that we've obviously been forced, if I can use that word, forced into developing this framework because it was for the good of the civil service and of the country and for the country. So one thing that we've done differently is to actually establish the framework and to show it to chief officers. They have actually, some chief officers have actually made a contribution to the establishment of this framework. And so I think that certainly is an improvement from where we were before. In addition to that, Mr. Chairman, I would say that the relatively new Accountant General has restarted monthly meetings with chief financial officers with a view to getting things on track, going over with CFOs what is required of them. And certainly I think the action of the Deputy Governor holding bi-weekly, usually on a Monday afternoon, meetings with his chief officers in which the relationship between the chief officers and the Deputy Governor has grown much tighter, much better, and they feel quite comfortable reporting any untoward activities to him. So I think those would be the main things that we have done: the development of the framework itself, the reestablishment of the monthly meetings with CFOs, the meetings with the chief officers and the Deputy Governor every 2 weeks has been a great help as well. And Mr. Chairman, I would just draw members' attention. Hopefully, it will never come to that. But in the framework that is being suggested, there's actually a section in it that talks about directions, and it speaks to a situation where a chief officer is clashing with a minister, and the chief officer is of the view that something untoward is going on. And it concludes, the section in the framework concludes that, if that can't be resolved, the chief officer would say to the minister, well, you actually need to give me a direction to proceed in the way that you want me to proceed, even though I think it's wrong. And then it's then the minister's obviously responsibility for having taken it forward. We hope that that would never occur. And it also says in the framework that those directions then would have to be reported to the Deputy Governor and the Premier by the particular chief officer of directions issued by a minister that the chief officer thinks is not the way to go. But we'd hope that would never arise, Mr. Chair.
I think he had his hand up.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to make a comment. I just want to thank Mr. Jefferson for making clear what the new policy is going to achieve. I think it's incredibly important. If I could just step back for a second, for several years we've talked about the importance of the financial function in government and the importance that financial function has with regard to the overall management of public funds. And we have used the word leadership extensively, and I'm sure they're tired, everyone's tired of hearing it, but this is, I believe, a tremendous example of the kind of leadership in the financial function that we believe is essential in order to bring back and bring around the kind of accountability for the use of public funds that is necessary to ensure that legislators understand that there's value for money in the way that public servants are spending it. Otherwise, there is no way to do that. So this, I believe, is a very, very clear example of that kind of leadership. And I would like to congratulate, if you wish, I didn't realize it until this hearing, that it's the financial secretary that's taking the lead on it. But as always, however,
I'm more concerned about just stepping backward. You don't get home all today if you don't stop stepping back, you know.
There's more, I think there's, obviously, more like this needs to come, and we've been talking, and we have good conversations with the accountant general with regard to building different frameworks that will ensure going forward, legislators get better understanding of how public money has been spent.
This is, through you, Mr. Chairman, to the Auditor General as well. In your conclusion, I mean, you've stated that you think this situation could happen again. Is that now changed post the framework and other things, or is that still on the table, specifically number 78, right? Your opening sentence in that. Because I just want to know, you said you hadn't had the framework, et cetera, when the report was the draft framework, when the report was made. So this is on page 19, paragraph 78. It said, while the program ended in 2013, we believe that the same situation could happen again. Is that something you're leaving on the table, or now taking off, seeing that these steps have been made? And if you aren't taking it off the table, can you kind of tell us where the culture is now as you see it, not as kind of, changes based on this process, but just overall culture?
Let me, through you, Mr. Chair, in response to that question, when we wrote this report, we had some initial discussions with the administration, chief officers. We did get comments on our draft report at the time, which we used to craft the final version of this report. And it was left, at the time, our impression was that this, given the response that we got, that it could happen again. So that's why we included that comment in the report. Seeing that the government now is taking action to identify and clearly outline the roles of the minister and the chief officers, effectively further protecting the role of the chief officer in the administration of public funds, not only the entity funds, but the executive funds as well, which transfer payments cover. I have to say that I think, we'll have to not take back that statement, but say that statement is no longer probably on the table, as you point out.
I just wanted to clarify that, because everyone's now at this meeting said that their movement's going in the right direction. So I just wanted to have that on the record, Mr. Chairman. But in terms of the movements that you've seen, right, and you said it's a good first step, things could be done better, et cetera. Describe the very next steps then. I mean, not holistically, but what would you like to see now in quick succession based on the start that we have?
Well, I'd like the financial secretary and his officials, if I had the perfect world, I'd like to see him identify those programs in government that are being operated outside of this framework, and for him to have a meeting with those individuals to discuss individually their plans going forward in how they bring their programs into alignment with this new policy. A good example of that, and it's mentioned in the policy, this policy will pertain to programs for social assistance, for example. So he would then have each of those individuals highlight what is necessary in their ministry or their department. For example, it could be they may not have a person who can actually, take care of some of the activities that needs to be done. So we'll need a person with different skill sets in that ministry to actually implement this policy. Possibly some training for everyone so they understand the policy in its most intimate way, so that they understand. There's no lack of clarity in terms of how this policy should be implemented, and also to get feedback from those individuals who will be implementing the policy to make sure that if there's any challenges in implementing it, that they get everything from those individuals so that they can address them up front and not hear about them 2 years down the line when it's too late.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I think that brings us to an early conclusion this evening. Thanks, Mr. Jefferson, and I'd also like to add my congratulations and that of the committee for the work that you're doing on these transfer payments and stuff. And
Thank you, sir.
so, thank you all very much. Do you want to talk about whether we need to call? Do you think we need to call anybody else to this, or do you think we? Oh, there's nobody absent from this one. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think the point to which we have progressed with the report and the positive things that are already taking place, I don't know that any further delving into the negative side of it is going to be a productive use of our time. So if the committee is happy with that, I think we can say that terminates our inquiry into that report, the management of the nation building program. And then we need to determine whether we need to call any additional people for the National Land Development program for next week, other than the two are absent ones. You think that those will still be sufficient? Or?
I would question myself whether we need to do so.
Yeah, I think we need to get both of these in. Yeah, and
Mr. Thompson, as chair of the he would be about the only one that I would be inclined to see that there might be a need to do so. I certainly don't think we need a whole morning to do it.
The chief officer in the ministry, because there's a lot of things that we couldn't ask the people lower down who said they had sent stuff up to him, and we need to find out why they were not acted on.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we need both, Mr. Chairman, because, again, it goes back to a question, well, just from my own purposes, was who calls the shots, right? Is it the board itself or the people that convene or constitute the board?
Yeah, I was just wondering if we wanted to add anybody else to it. I don't think we do. So we can just make sure that those people know that they can come next Wednesday. So Thank you all very much, and the meeting is adjourned until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.